You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast, heard exclusively on roadrunnerrecords.com/skull sessions. And now, here is your host, Bob Nalbandian.
They say people out in Hollywood live their life out in black and white. They're living out a Technicolor dream. Next day they're a star.
Welcome, and thank you all for listening. This is the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast number 6. And I gotta tell you, man, this episode is something I've been waiting to do for a long time. If you are a Thin Lizzy fan, you are going to absolutely love this episode. That's right, this episode is fully dedicated to one of the most incredible rock bands of all time. I discuss the great Thin Lizzy with two of perhaps the biggest Thin Lizzy fans in this world. That is, of course, the great Jon Sutherland and Brian Slagel, CEO of Metal Blade Records. We're going to get right into this because this is a long one, and I didn't want to edit out too much because there were just too damn many great stories told by Jon Sutherland in this podcast. So it's going to run about an hour and a half. And for those not familiar with Jon Sutherland, he is perhaps the metal guru, as I like to call him. He is a guy that I grew up pretty much worshiping as a journalist and a metal connoisseur. I was very fortunate to be very good friends with Jon Sutherland when I lived in Hollywood throughout the late 80s on through the beginning of the new millennium. And if there was anyone that I needed to talk to about heavy metal that knew all the answers, especially when it came to classic metal, it was Jon Sutherland. No matter what conversation we would have, UFO, Thin Lizzy, Judas Priest, whatever, I always referred to Jon Sutherland for the right answer. He knew everything. He knew all. Not only did he know everything, he could tell you a great story behind it. So a great guy, and it's so great to talk to Jon Sutherland again. I haven't spoken to him in quite some time. And of course, many of you know of the great Brian Slagel. He has been the CEO of Metal Blade Records since the early 80s, since he did the very first Metal Massacre record, which I believe was 1981, was it? That featured, of course, the very first recordings of Metallica, amongst many other bands. And since then, as you all know, I don't need to tell you the story about Metal Blade. They've become one of the largest and greatest independent heavy metal labels in the world. So, with that said, let's get right into this. Brian and I came out quite clear, but Jon Sutherland was a bit soft-spoken, so you might have to turn it up in places. I tried to do what I could to increase the quality of this podcast, but nonetheless, this is an incredible discussion. Of course, like the other discussions we have, we do go through the entire Thin Lizzy catalog, but we also get into a lot of great stories that Jon Sutherland will share. Of course, Jon has been very, very close with Thin Lizzy throughout the years. He was a fan of the band since day one and followed the band ever since. And once again, some great stories here. So let's get right into it. Before we do, if you do need to email me, please do so. The email address is shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. And of course, the podcast, if you got it by a link or whatever and you want some more information on the podcast, you could always go to the Shockwave Skull Sessions homepage, which is roadrunnerrecords.com/skull sessions. And on that page, you could download the podcast. You could listen to it directly through the MP3 player. And of course, you could also get the podcast on iTunes. Just go to the iTunes store, type in Shockwave Skull Sessions, and it will pop right up. As well as the sister podcast, the Shockwaves Hard Radio podcast. Also, both are available on many other podcast directories. So, subscribe to the podcast and please send in those comments. I love to hear from you guys, especially about this episode. So, with that said, man, I think we could get right into it. So let's do it, man. This is the great discussion on Thin Lizzy with my great guests, Jon Sutherland and Brian Slagel. Enjoy. So we got Jon Sutherland.
Hey, hello. How you doing, John?
Doing great, Bob. Great to talk to you.
And Brian Slagel, president of I should say CEO of Metal Blade Records.
Head janitor.
There you go. So, of course, for those that don't know, Jon Sutherland is probably the biggest expert I've ever known on Thin Lizzy. And, of course, Brian, a very long-time fan of Thin Lizzy as well. And this is going to be a good one, guys. I'm excited. So, as always, we'll go through the entire catalog, starting with the first record, give you guys' views on what you thought of it. So I guess we'll go back to 71, when the self-titled debut came out. Now, was this actually out in America?
It had two covers. The first one in England came out, and I worked at a record store at that time, and we would get records later. They weren't simultaneously released in those days like they are now. And the English one came out, and I bought it, and it was the hubcap cover that you're familiar with.
Right.
And then the American one came out when they got licensed to Phonogram, and it was a picture of a girl's butt with a little car driving over it. So I got both of them. But I remember buying the record at the record store, and I opened up every record and played it. I just did. And I heard Hendrix, I heard Love, I heard Van Morrison, and I heard a really distinctive voice, and I thought, well, I'm going to pay attention to this band. But it definitely wasn't a favorite band. It didn't happen on the first record. What happened was he put out an EP, I don't know if you guys remember this, but it had Dublin on it and a couple other songs that kind of came out between the first and second record. That showed me that the band had a lot more depth than I had anticipated.
Yeah, I think, the first record, I was one of those ones that came in a couple years later, so I had to go back to those early records. And, it's kind of, one interesting point I wanted to make was about how amazing just the whole career of Thin Lizzy was. If that band had come out today, and let's say that first record came out, I mean, that band would have been come and gone, and nothing would ever happen. I mean, really, the first three records. Because it wasn't really until after that they kind of figured out. That's the way it was in the 70s, obviously. But it's really interesting to know, how bands, don't change that much and aren't given much time to do that these days. Whereas, if that was the case back then, you never would have had, Thin Lizzy, which is, probably one of the most influential rock bands of all time.
Well, we all think back about all of our favorite bands usually hit on their second and third record. But Thin Lizzy didn't hit till their sixth.
Really. I mean, they finally got in their groove, I think, around Fighting. But
they didn't get here. They didn't play live until Jailbreak. But they got over to the East Coast for a few dates on Fighting, and then they made it over here later. But they got dropped after their third record. They did get dropped.
Now, that was on Decca, right? Was their first label?
They had Decca, which was a Phonogram. It was just like the Warner Brothers family, where they have a bunch of labels that are signed to them. They were signed to Decca, which is a Phonogram thing. And then they did their second record, which was Tales of a Blue Orphanage. And I didn't really like that record that much. It just was more folky and...
Shades of a Blue Orphanage.
Yeah, Shades, yeah.
Blue Orphanage was the...
He just blew his covers being Thin Lizzy expert.
You were mixing Deep Purple with Thin Lizzy there.
There you go. Probably same year. That was the name of a band that Eric Bell was in. And then I didn't like that record that much, and I kind of put him on the back burner.
Well, the first three records were very folky.
Very much so.
Very much.
Well, you know what's interesting
too about to an extent.
You know what's interesting to me about those first three records? If you go back now, and there's so many of these Thin Lizzy releases, like all the BBC stuff that came out, and when they were doing the BBC stuff back then with the Eric Bell years, the live stuff that they did on the BBC and some of all that other stuff where they kind of re-recorded on some of those rock shows was actually really good and had a little more of a hard rock influence.
Right.
But the production on those records was very, very bluesy.
Right.
So English bands in those days were very, very subservient to the producers, and a lot of them were afraid to blow their record career by not making the producer happy. But when they played live, they didn't have to worry about that. A lot of the records were tame, and the live was really, really good. But after Shades of the Blue Orphanage, they came out with Whiskey in the Jar, and it was not even on either one of those records, and it was a huge hit.
Well, that was a single first.
Yeah, it was a single.
Because they had an album called Whiskey in a Jar. That was what I remembered.
Whiskey in the Jar was never on an official release. It was only on compilation.
It wasn't on Vagabonds?
No. Vagabonds was the record, the first one I really, really loved. I played the hell out of that record. And The Rocker was on it. That's what it told me that they could really, really kick ass if they wanted to.
Right.
Yeah, another song from Vagabonds that I always like, and I know they played it a lot live, was Little Girl in Bloom. So it wasn't a real hard rock song, but that was one of the ones that I think he was starting to really get his stride as a songwriter at that point. Really good lyrics, really good melodies, and I always really liked the song. And of course, The Rocker was the shining star of that record.
But the Little Girl in Bloom showed the depth or his range as a songwriter. For somebody at the age of like 21 to write a song about a pregnant girl that's going to have to deal with telling her boyfriend that she's going to have a baby, that's a huge sign of maturity.
Yeah, they were way ahead of their time.
Way ahead of their time.
Well, I still think to me, the greatest songwriter in rock for me is Phil Lynott. I mean, the guy is just any sort of type of music is just lyrics. melodies, styles, absolutely phenomenal. It blew me away, just in terms of how great a songwriter he is.
Yeah, very poetic, too.
Yeah, it's one thing that's really interesting about Thin Lizzy, and, it's funny because John and I had a part in putting together that documentary, or the, behind the music thing that they did. And the thing that bummed me out about that, and I know John as well, was, that they didn't really get into, I mean, you had Def Leppard, you had Axl, you had Hetfield, you had all these phenomenal bands who really said the same thing. Like Phil Lynott is one of the greatest songwriters of all time and had such a huge influence on the Bono, all these people. He still, I think, doesn't get his due for all that stuff, which really kind of annoys me because, you look at all these, and of course he's gone, but still, Hendrix and Clapton and all these guys get, put in the same breath, and nobody really remembers Thin Lizzy, which, because, they didn't have all the hits over here.
I think in Europe a lot more so than in America. It is really annoying because not many Americans even know
in Europe, though, I mean, you get some there, but not as much as you should.
Right.
Thin Lizzy everybody thinks they should have been a bigger band than they were. And I think if they were bigger in America, that would have helped that equation. But, being a journalist and talking to these people, that was always like the one subject I could always go to that everybody would be happy about. Everybody wanted to talk about Phil. Everybody wanted to have met him or asked me about him. He was just a real lovable guy, and he was a great, influence on all these other bands. I mean, please, Guns N' Roses, Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, almost any band that has two guitars at least knows who Thin Lizzy is. They learned a lot from him.
Absolutely.
And one thing I wanted to say when Brian was talking about the songwriting, there's only two artists in my lifetime that I think never repeated themselves, and that's Jimi Hendrix and Phil Lynott. Every other band, I can find songs that sound like each other. But Thin Lizzy, every song is a complete island. And Gary Moore told me once in an interview that Phil taught him a lot. Phil taught him what a song really was, and to never let it out there until you really, really felt good about it.
Well, you told me an interesting, great story once about when you had met with Bob Dylan.
It's the Grammy story. What it was I was standing at a Grammy party, and I was about a little bit farther outside of the rope where all the really big guys were there. And remember when they were having that feud in Band Magazine where Gene Simmons and Bob Dylan were writing letters back and forth?
Oh, yeah.
Hysterical. Because Bob Dylan, thought Kiss was nothing.
And Bill Holdship, wasn't it?
Kiss was a better songwriter than Dylan, all that crap. But anyways, Gene Simmons and Bob Dylan were talking, and Bill Holdship, the editor of the band, was my boss, was there. And Holdship saw me looking over, and he said, "Oh, what about Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy?" And Gene Simmons goes, "Oh, he was a junkie." And then Bob Dylan said, "No, he wasn't. He was a genius." And he turned around and walked away.
Wow.
For Bob Dylan to think Phil Lynott was a genius, that works for me. But you guys, after Vagabonds came out and Eric Bell quit on New Year's Eve, they got dropped by Phonogram.
Well, you got to remember, they were a three-piece then, right? And that was just Eric and Phil?
They brought Eric Moore in the beginning.
Oh, they did?
Replaced Eric Bell. All those guys were friends.
Now, they were all Irish, correct? Those three?
But Eric Bell and Gary were from Belfast. Phil was from Dublin.
Right.
And they all knew each other. They all played with each other. They, Gary and Phil kind of went through Skid Row, in and out at the same time. Gary came in and they thought he was going to be permanent, but he had that, Jazz Jones, and he always wanted to be Jeff Beck.
Now, he didn't record any albums with him, because I know he had that Skid Row project in those days.
He recorded one song, Little Darling.
Okay.
Which was a very Bob Seger kind of, upbeat,
Rosalie. Well, of course they did Rosalie after. They were a big Bob Seger.
Kind of a song. It was a good song. They still do it. They did it a lot live. And if you hear the woo-woo that Steve Miller used, Gary Moore invented that. But anyways, Gary didn't stay. And then they did a short little German tour with Andy G. and John Kahn. And John Kahn was from Atomic Rooster, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And Andy G. played with Peter Barden before they were Camel. And those guys lasted, 6 weeks? So they had that tour contracted. And they needed the money, so they finished the tour, and those guys didn't work out. So they went back to England. They had recorded a bunch of demos, and they got signed back to Phonogram based on the song called Still in Love with You, which is the only song that Gary Moore ever wrote while he was in Thin Lizzy with Phil. And the solo was so amazing, and they told the record company the solo was played by this 18-year-old Scotsman from Brian Roberts. They told him that Rob would play the solo, and he hadn't. Gary had played the solo. So they they picked Robbo first, and then Gorham went to England to audition for Supertramp because the sister was married to the drummer in Supertramp.
I remember that,
And that didn't work out, and so they sent him down the hall, and he got a job that lasted another 14 years.
And that, like what John mentioned earlier, getting into nightlife, and 1974 that came out. That was, and that's really when I started to really come into the picture more so is in that record. And people forget, John mentioned earlier about this is the band that really started the two guitar attack. I mean, they were one of the first bands ever to have those dueling guitars, and that really came out on Nightlife. That to me was, of course, that I'm sure everybody could agree is that was the really one where they really kind of found their niche, and with Brian and Scott in there playing guitars, I think that allowed Phil to really explore. the heavier and hard rock side, because now he had these two great guitar players that could kind of play off each other, and that to me like just opened up this gigantic can of worms that Phil could really use to create these masterpieces.
Two things that to be said about that was Phil told me once that Gary had two sides to him. He had the really wild, crazy side, like you hear in Little Darling, and when he played, when he would wrap it up, and he had that slick kind of sweet jazzy side. So he had this Heckle and Jive personality, and when he got the two guitar players, then Robbo was wild and Scott was slick. So they always had that combination, slick, glum, and then the other guy was always wild. The only guy that wasn't was Snowy White. He's the guy that didn't work.
Right.
Every other guitar player that played off of Scott was wild. Sykes, Gary Moore, Robbo, they were all guys that could just really fly, and Scott just nailed it down.
Now I want to ask you,
at that time, Wishbone Ash and the Allman Brothers had both been doing the dual guitars, but they didn't do it the way Thin Lizzy did it.
Exactly.
The Allman Brothers did the slide and the straight. Wishbone Ash, one guy was playing a Fender, one guy was playing a Gibson, and they were playing in harmony. But Thin Lizzy would play in unison, they would play in harmonies, and they would play off all these different technical ways that other bands hadn't done, and they did it in every song.
Yeah, and all those bands are all blues bands basically, and I think Wishbone Ash and Savoy Brown definitely had much more of a trueness to the blues thing, whereas Thin Lizzy kind of had that little edge. And I mean, that really, I'm sure people can debate me on this all day long, and I'll go back at it. But people talk about who invented metal, and everybody goes back to Sabbath and all that stuff, which I tend to certainly agree upon. But Thin Lizzy, Phil, and especially those two guitar players, really created a much different sound than had been done before. And of course, as we mentioned, all these metal bands have Thin Lizzy as such a huge influence. And I think that's because the way they played, the structure of the songs, the structure of the riffs, the dueling guitars, the harmonies. Iron Maiden never would have existed if it wasn't for Thin Lizzy.
The first time I heard Iron Maiden, I go, Thin Lizzy on speed. I'll tell you, one of the reasons that it worked out that way, I had got my hands on some of Phil's demo, and he wouldn't play guitar on the demo. He'd have a drum machine.
Was this back then?
Yeah.
You knew it? Wow.
Yeah.
And it's really funny. One of my best friends is Jimmy Koo. He's playing NWK, and he's really big friends with Philomena, and he's going to go through Phil's tapes this summer and see what's there.
So much of that stuff is on bootlegs. I think I have about 150 Thin Lizzy bootlegs. So.
Well, they have a new live record coming out.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
That's when they really found their legs.
That 75, I have, I think, 7 or 8 really, really great bootlegs from that tour. And, yeah, they were destroying on that tour. So the one, I'm not sure which show that they have mentioned there, but I'm pretty sure, because a lot of that, like I said, all that stuff's out on bootleg. There's a really good German show, and there's a couple of UK shows.
This is a UK tour.
Yeah.
Fighting My Way Back.
He did that live at the college. It's the same place, Rockland College.
Yeah, exactly.
So I've got a lot of shows from those areas. A lot of these things were radio broadcasts. And you'd get them on tapes, and people would, record them that night, and it'd make its way around the world to a bootleg. But
I can't let Nightlife go by without saying that I think it's hard to say because I go back and forth on my favorite Thin Lizzy songs, but it's Only Money. I absolutely worship that song.
Look at that now,
definitely one of my all-time favorite songs.
Sha La La was one of my favorites and still is.
It's Only Money, you guys. That's a rap song. It really is. Listen to it. He's not singing. He's talking.
And that riff, though, is just crushing. I mean, but for that, for 1974, I think that's one of the heaviest riffs ever. That da-da-da-da-da-da, and the two guitars come in. They just that's that full dual guitar and metal sound, and that's the one thing that you didn't really have with Sabbath or any of those bands was the two different guitar players playing the same sort of riff. They both have a different style, a different feel, a different sound, and that two guitar fullness is really what led to all the stuff that we're listening to the last 30 plus years.
Well, Gary Moore had guessed that he had done some guitars on that record too, right?
Yeah, he played the lead on Still in Love with You, but I think that's the only thing that he played on that record.
And also says Frankie Miller did some vocals on it.
Yeah, he sang the first verse on Still in Love with You.
Interesting.
Phil didn't really know what he wanted to do at that time. I mean, I think that record they kind of figured it out through that record, because look what Fighting became.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing about Nightlife, I think up until then, that was definitely the best produced Thin Lizzy record. And that was produced by Ron Nevison.
Yeah,
of course, worked with Zeppelin and did all the UFO
but that record
stuff.
was done in stages where they do 2 songs here, 3 songs there, where Fighting was all the songs were written, they all went in there, and they recorded it as live as they could, as much as they could.
Yeah, I mean, for 74, I mean, it still stands out today, production-wise.
Definitely. Now, something I want to mention to you, which you probably know about this, John. I was looking on a Thin Lizzy discography, and there was something in 1973, just prior to Nightlife. It says, Funky Junction, play a tribute to Deep Purple.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's a good story. John will tell you that, but
I don't know that one. I don't know that one well, but I know Richie Blackmore was trying to form a super band with Paul Rogers and Phil Lynott. It almost happened because Thin Lizzy wasn't going anywhere, and Phil was a huge Paul Rogers fan. In fact, he said he would never put out a live record until his live record sounded as good as Free Live record. So
oh, really?
Free-lived it, yeah. But at the time, Richie Blackmore had all the clout.
Right.
He was the big star, and he had the superstar band.
And he was a huge Paul Rogers fan as well.
Oh, yeah, they all were. But that was the big excuse to put all that stuff together. And they actually recorded some songs that Phil did, Blackmore songs.
I read in a Deep Purple book that there's actually, like you said, recordings that was done with Phil, Blackmore, and Ian Pace.
I'm not surprised, because at that time, Thin Lizzy wasn't in that good a shape.
But there's a great story about Blackmore and Phil that happened in the Rainbow. I think it was 75, and there was this proposed tour. Or actually, Phil was trying. He's trying to get Thin Lizzy to do more in the States, and this is Rainbow was really big, and Phil was a big Blackmore fan, but Phil was wasted. And he's going on, and they're trying to put together this tour, and Blackmore was kind of like, whatever, blah blah blah. And so Phil was like, finally got so frustrated, and he was so drunk that he went up to Blackmore and goes, "Fuck you, my band will blow your band off the stage. I have the greatest band in the world, and we will destroy you," and all this stuff. And I think Blackmore's like, "Whoa, watch out, this guy's out of control."
I heard Phil was like that a lot. When they would play with bands, they would do these festivals with, UFO and ACD, whatever bands, Aerosmith, and Phil would just get right in their face. But what I thought was fucking great, because it was a competition. I mean, live, you didn't have video, you didn't have anything. You had to prove yourselves live.
Well, that was a problem for management, because they knew Phil did that.
Right.
And they used to be lining up these tours, and Phil would get in these conversations, and all of a sudden the tour would disappear. So
I'll tell you what, though, if there was a Rainbow Thin Lizzy tour around 1976, if I would cut off my hand to be put back in time to see that.
I don't think that came here, because in 76...
No, it never happened. It never happened because of that, supposedly because of that Phil with Blackmore.
Oh, that would have been awesome.
When they came over, they were playing with Bachman Turner and Bob Seger, and Scott Gorham told me that they were given, 45, 50 minutes, full lights, full PA, and they were killing Bachman Turner so bad that at the end of the dates, they got 20 minutes, no lights, no stage, no PA, and they couldn't bring beer backstage.
Well, yeah, that happened a lot to Thin Lizzy, and that was, one of the many problems they had in the States was that it was, either A, they had tours booked and then Phil got sick and they couldn't do them, or B, they would come over and they'd just torch everybody else on the bill, and they would kind of get thrown off. I saw unfortunately, the only time I ever got to see Thin Lizzy was in '79 when Gary Moore was playing.
That's when they opened for Journey, right?
Yeah, I played those two shows with Journey.
That was the only time I remember them on the West Coast. It's funny, because I talked to a lot of people in the Midwest, and they did a lot, like in Michigan, Detroit, they did a lot of these big festivals out there that, the ones that, like the Cal Jam and the California Music Fest that we had here, over there with Thin Lizzy, but Thin Lizzy were never on any of those bills that I remember on the West Coast.
They didn't make it here. Phil would get sick or something would happen, but I remember they played on the East Coast, and they did a bunch of shows, and they got about as far west as Detroit, and they liked Bob Seger, and Bob Seger took them out a lot, but they couldn't get over here. The first time they got here was June 2nd, 1976 on Jailbreak. Because I heard about both the tours, but they didn't make it here, and then they got sick. And I remember the time when Robbo cut his hand, 5 hours before the plane was supposed to take off, and they brought Gary Moore in. Remember John Butcher from John Butcher Axis?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He used to live out here. I used to see him around once in a while. Well, what happened was when they got the tour with Queen finally, which was the big break, they had to come over, and they had to sit around for 4 or 5 days to get Gary into the groove so they could catch up on the tour. And Phil stayed with John Butcher, and Phil was just telling John, if you're going to make it in black, you're going to get a lot more crap. In rock, you're going to get a lot more crap because you're black. And he was really just reading them the riot act. And then I had heard when they got the tour with Queen, he had pulled the same crap on Queen, telling them they were going to kick their ass every night. But Brian May loved the band so much that they got that through when they finally came over here. And when Jailbreak came out, what an amazing record that was.
Absolutely.
Well,
yeah, that was over fighting, though. Let's before we get into jail.
Fighting to me just did established their style. I like to tell the story. I went to New Zealand on a track tour in 1976, and I get off the airplane, and the airport over there in Auckland is like the size of Burbank. I get off the airplane, I'm walking across the tarmac, and I hear a Wild One over the PA. And I'm going, God, this is a great country. Thin Lizzy song in an airport. I go, you're kidding me. But,
yeah, they did well. Obviously, they did well down in Australia. I had the DVD that came out and everything down there.
Great.
So
That's great. But you know what? When you look at Wild One, that song's about all the great English writers and poets that went away and didn't come back. That's why the Irish always had so much love for Phil, because he made himself a star, but he always came back. Van Morrison moved to Oakland, never went back to Ireland. They hated him for that. But Phil would always come back. He would always come back. And, I really hoped I'd see the Fighting Tour, and I got a couple bootlegs and some live shows and stuff like that. But it wasn't until Jailbreak that they really got a proper tour and really got to come here.
yeah, I mean, they were doing a lot of stuff, like we mentioned, those bootlegs, and there's some really great bootlegs from that 75 tour. And it's interesting because, I always kind of thought, I mean, back then, people put out records so often, and, look, there's great songs on both Nightlife and Fighting, but if you had combined the two of them into one record, because they did a lot of that with the live stuff, they're playing all the stuff that you really wanted to hear now, just blown away about how aggressive and heavy and, really good that stuff was, and, then they had throw in the great ballads. But those two records, I love both of them, and there's some incredible songs, but there's also a few things on there that you're kind of like, maybe not.
I agree. Well, Thin Lizzy were one of those kind of bands, and it's funny, back then, a lot of those bands, Nazareth were kind of the same, and even Queen to some extent. Some songs were just stellar, and then other songs, I mean, for me, because I was always, a hard rock metal fan at that time, so I never really got into Thin Lizzy until later, listening back to them. I mean, I was into them, when, Jailbreak and all those records came out, but I was still more into, that was when I was really getting into AC/DC and Judas Priest and Rainbow and all that. So, Thin Lizzy were always one of those bands that I liked a lot more now than I did back then.
Yeah, but what you guys did was different. You guys are younger than me. When I grew up, it wasn't a sign of weakness for a band to do a tender song. I mean, it was okay for Phil to play Sarah and play Warrior. It was okay.
Well, I think that was also kind of what set them apart from everybody. It's like, look, Phil, obviously they're a hard rock band, and a lot of all their hits and stuff are hard rock. But that's why I said earlier, like Phil, to me, even back then, I liked a lot of the slower stuff. I always had a really weird, I always liked really heavy stuff, but I also liked the contrast of really well crafted and well done ballads. And to me, that was what Phil would do. I mean, so many of those ballads, just that you could feel the emotion, of what was going on there, especially on the record. Just incredible.
One thing that I always like to make the comparison, and it's kind of funny, but if you really listen to both these bands, you could really hear their similarities. You could hear how much Steely Dan was influenced by Thin Lizzy. I mean, you listen to Reeling in the Years, the dual guitars, and I would say if Thin Lizzy, Broken American, wasn't as hard rock, you listen to Dancing in the Moonlight, you listen to Fats, songs like that. That's like right up there with the kind of jazzy, radio-oriented Steely Dan kind of stuff. Thin Lizzy could have and should have been a huge radio band, but unfortunately, after Boys Are Back in Town, the radio just burned down on that song. But, latter albums, like I said, Dancing in the Moonlight could have been huge.
They had a lot of issues. I mean, whenever they'd have a big song out there, the tour would fall apart, or Phil get sick, or guitar player would quit. They went through a lot of hardships. They really did.
Yeah, and they also, by the time they kind of had something happening over here, there was so much competition, and you had Aerosmith and Kiss and Alice Cooper. There's so many hard rock bands out there that were trying to, get on the radio. There's only so much you can get played, and it's still a game. Back then, you had to have the right label and the right management and the right this, and you had to have people getting your songs played on the radio, and Thin Lizzy just never really had that opportunity. Like John said, too, the other thing that really killed them was they would get these great tour opportunities to really come over and nail it down, and then something would happen.
I think lyrically they were probably a little bit too deep, particularly for America, because most of the bands, the Ted Nugent, Aerosmith, the bands that had made it big here, and of course Van Halen when they came, it was more of the party kind of lyrics. The thing about Thin Lizzy is they were right in between, and back then and now more so than ever. But even back then, you had to either be kind of one or the other. And Thin Lizzy were one of those bands that you couldn't categorize. I mean, they were just
I mean, Aerosmith was kind of that way a little bit too, but maybe not to the degree that.
Well, a lot of those bands added more blues. I mean, you look at even Free, Humble Pie, Zeppelin, Aerosmith. All those guys really not even influenced. They stole from blues artists. Thin Lizzy didn't. Thin Lizzy were they were more on the Irish folk thing. They were completely different than any other band.
You'll never hear anybody call Thin Lizzy blues band. You can't.
No, they're not.
They're not because
I mean, you could say Queen was original, but I think Queen took from Sweet, and I think Queen took a lot from Nazareth, actually, if you listen to some of their stuff.
Sure. Well, that's the thing about Thin Lizzy. What makes them so unique is that they didn't really take from anybody. They were doing completely their own thing, and that also, I'm sure, hurt them as well. Because if you're, especially if you try to be mainstream and you're doing something that's a little bit different than everybody else, the mainstream's not going to necessarily.
I think it was very difficult to market that band, particularly in the States.
Well, and they couldn't tour too. That was the biggest problem as well. Even back then, you had to tour.
Why was it? Was it just a problem Phil had with other bands, or that Phil?
You name it. I mean, Phil would go a little crazy, and things would drop out. But mostly they had, Phil got sick a couple times right before they had a couple huge opportunities. Like, John mentioned Robbo, cut his hand. There's always seemed like there was something that happened to really derail a lot of these U.S. tours.
Right.
You guys mentioned 3 or 4 parts of the business. Thin Lizzy always had great management. They always did.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that.
They looked after them very well, but they didn't have radio hits that they wanted to work. I don't think people were ready for a black man in front of a rock band. It had been done by Hendrix, but I used to see people in crowds all the time saying he doesn't look like his voice. Nobody'd ever seen anything like it. It was too unbelievable. It really was.
Yep, I think you hit the nail on the head there as well.
Yeah. They were just such a great band, and to me, they were so original because they did not resemble anybody else. They were original. You had a black Irish, you had to root for the underdog. People used to always ask me, why do you like Thin Lizzy so much? He goes, easy. They're the underdog. I mean, Phil, when he grew up, he was literally the only black kid in the whole country.
Right.
And he had it really, really rough, and he had to make it, and he had a different sense of modality coming from Ireland and growing up there. He didn't hear American blues. He heard Irish jigs and pop songs, and so he grew up on different things. But I think the black thing hurt him a little bit. The fact that he wasn't just a front man, that he played the bass and couldn't run around and do all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of reasons, but I think a lot of it came down to the record companies too. They didn't know what to do with him.
Right.
They definitely were not at the right spot with the record companies. I know people that worked there at that time, and there were definitely some huge Thin Lizzy fans, and it was difficult for them to get the company to focus for more than 5 minutes on them for whatever reason. Someone talking about we're doing Jailbreak and Johnny the Fox, which were both produced by John Alcock, who also produced my good friend Earl Slick, the Earl Slick band Razor Sharp, which is another phenomenal record. But Earl told me, I asked him about Alcock because he produced a lot of great records back then, including these two, which were phenomenal records.
Absolutely.
And he said Alcock was just nuts, completely insane. Said one night they were like just sitting around doing all sorts of drugs and completely high, and Mike Alcock had a gun, and they're sitting in the studio, and he's like shooting the walls out of the studio and everything, just completely nuts.
Well, that was
I can only imagine what those
Jack Douglas as well with Aerosmith. He was a nut too. They were all into.
Well, with Phil, being him, and with Alcock, I can imagine those sessions must have been pretty insane.
Well, they told me I got to know everybody in Thin Lizzy over the 14 years they were together. It's pretty good. And the guy I got to know the best was Scott. And Scott, I asked him who was the producer that they thought was the best, and they said Visconti. They all thought he was the best guy they worked with, and he was real straight, and he could keep them together. But he had trouble with the band because Brian believed that one take was good enough, and he could go drink. And Scott would labor and take him longer to get his parts done, and Phil would stay there for days and days and hours and do everything. And he had all these different personalities. In the end, it was Phil's band, but they were their own worst enemy in a lot of ways. Robert was a hothead. He'd get in fights all the time.
Oh yeah, he was crazy. He was another crazy guy.
He's a little bit more sedate now, but
that's what made that band work so well, though.
Well, they played off of each other. Think about all the great guitar players in Thin Lizzy. The best combination, everybody will always tell you, is Robbo and Scott.
And those, of course, and those 4 musicians together, because Brian Downey is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
Very underrated drummer, yeah.
Absolutely incredible.
Very underrated. Nobody ever talks about him because he's such a jazzy drummer, but he's really incredible.
How many of you listen to that stuff, especially on some of the heavier songs? I mean, just like Emerald or Warriors.
Bad Reputation.
Yeah. Going back to the songwriting, you guys, you would never hear Van Halen write a song about the Romans invading Ireland. Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, Phil, that was the other thing, is he was an incredibly intelligent guy.
History, all the Irish history and all the lore. He loved that stuff.
People say musically how Iron Maiden took from Thin Lizzy, but I think even lyrically, a lot of Bruce Dickinson's lyrics, I mean, you listen to Trooper and all that other stuff, I think very much he was influenced by the lyrics of it.
I wrote a story once that the 10 original bands since Jimi Hendrix and heavy metal, and Dickinson must have read it because he gave a speech that was basically reading my story. And I named the bands that I thought were completely original, and Thin Lizzy was one of them. And then so somebody tried to flatter Scott or Bruce and say, well, Iron Maiden's an original band, and he just shut it down in one sentence. Nope, we got too much Thin Lizzy on us.
Well, yeah, they're all the, Steve Harris and Bruce and, Adrian Smith, all those guys are humongous Thin Lizzy fans.
Sure.
Yeah, they did Massacre, of course, to cover. Let me ask you, John, a question, because I have very strong feelings about this. If you look at Jailbreak and Johnny the Fox, which of those two records do you like better?
Oh, Jailbreak by far.
I am a Johnny the Fox guy.
I got a great Johnny the Fox story, but that record was recorded too fast, and I think what happened was they should have waited longer to do that record.
Well, they were both released in '76 within, I think,
March '76 was Jailbreak, and October '76 was Johnny the Fox. They're trying to. That was back when people had 2 records in a year, and they were trying to get something out really quick. But absolutely love Johnny the Fox. Like Johnny, Rocky, Borderline, Don't Believe a Word. Fool's Gold is one of my all-time. That's probably my favorite Thin Lizzy song. Massacre's on there. Johnny the Fox and Give Me the Weed. It's amazing.
Yeah. It's a great record. But Scott told me they only had 2 weeks off in 10 years. They were so afraid that they would lose their spot and somebody would go flying by them that as soon as they got off the road, they'd go right back in the studio.
Well, of course, because Boys Are Back in Town off Jailbreak was a huge success, and I think they tried to ride on that too quick.
They had to. I mean, that's just the way record companies thought in those days. Elton John had 9 records in his first 3 years.
I mean, everybody back in like '76, every band had to have 2 records out. I mean, everybody's discography.
I think if they would have, put more time into some of the records, it might have helped. But they just didn't live in the era that you could do that.
Yep.
And the records didn't make as much money. Touring didn't make as much money. Merchandising didn't exist up until about '76, '77 anyway. And I never saw T-shirts at shows until about the mid-'70s.
Well, let me going back to Thin Lizzy live. I think you guys have probably seen this as well. See, I've never seen Thin Lizzy live back in the day. The only time I saw him was, the John Sykes version. But, I have old videos and stuff, and I never realized how big they were in America. Have you seen the one that they did on, I think it was on Midnight Special? They did one where an AC/DC was on the same show.
Sure.
And this was with Bon Scott. They did Sin City. And people were kind of lax and mellow. And this is AC/DC, one of the most energetic live bands. And this is when they were at their prime, And Thin Lizzy comes on this cowboy song, and the crowd goes absolutely fucking nuts.
Well, some of that was also them, mixing in the crowd a little louder, I think, as well.
Yeah,
I remember staying up for that because I forget how old I was, but I was a huge AC/DC and Thin Lizzy fan, and it was the first time I'd seen AC/DC. I remember staying up until really late, trying to stay awake to watch that. I think it was must have been '76, I would guess.
Yeah.
So you guys, Thin Lizzy was as good a live band as I've ever seen. I mean, their musicianship was unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, you see that if you see any of the DVDs and stuff. Back then, especially the stuff they were doing, even the bootleg stuff. That people weren't overdubbing or anything. And I mean, they were spot on every single show.
And that's what blew me away. And at that point, I didn't even know who the singer was. Then seeing this black guy playing bass and just putting on this amazing performance. So I agree. I think if Thin Lizzy were more of a live band and toured a lot more, I think you and I got into the discussion, John, about why bands like, you take a band like Queen and Sweet. Queen got into the American market, or Foghat and Status Quo. Status Quo is huge in Europe. Foghat, also being a British band, they came to America, conquered America. And those are the bands that came to America at the right time, toured. I think if Thin Lizzy had done that.
Well, yeah, I think that's a given. I think that's to me, that's one of the main reasons why they never really hit it that huge here. So they just didn't spend enough time here.
Another thing you guys probably don't know, Scott told me this, that they did the first 8 records with Phonogram, and then they did the last 6 with Warner Brothers.
Yep.
And when they got signed to Warner Brothers, Phil came over here and started living in L.A., and Scott told me this story, and it absolutely, totally broke my heart. He was getting drunk and hanging out at the Starwood, and one night Warner Brothers was having a party for some band at the Starwood, and Phil wanted to go to the party, and the girl wouldn't let him in at the door. And he goes, I'm a Warner Brothers recording artist. I want to go to this party. But she wouldn't let him in, so he just walked around her, and she pulled at him, and she fell down the stairs. And Phil just went into the party, went about his business, and she was really pissed at the guy. The next day she came back in. Her boss was the head of promotions at Warner Brothers. She told him that Phil had threw her down the staircase, and he pulled the plug on the band. And the band knew it. And they found out that they weren't going to get any help from Warner Brothers, and they'd signed for 6 records.
Yeah, well, I remember that some of the stores. We spent a few years over there. We issued all the Warner records that.
You did Black Rose and Chinatown and Renegade and Thunder and Lightning.
Renegade. Thunder and Lightning and Live Life. We did all those, all Warner Brothers records.
Yeah,
we had the rights to all that stuff.
When I was with Brian at Metal Blade, one of the things we did was go get records from other bands, and we went after that Thin Lizzy catalog, and I went over there and I met with their catalog guy, and I said, how come you guys haven't put out the Thin Lizzy records on CD? And he says, well, we only put out CDs on bands that sold 100,000 records. And he pulled up the sales figures for me, and it blew my mind how few records.
It was terrible.
Ford sold more records than Thin Lizzy, I'm telling you.
No.
It was sad. So we went after, and Metal Blade got those records and resurfaced them and got them back out there. They weren't in print for quite a while.
Are they still available, Brian, on Metal Blade, the CDs?
No, we had a license that ran its course. So now Warner's has a different company that they license stuff to. It's a Wounded Bird or somebody else that.
Oh yeah,
they put they've been out in a bunch of different configurations. But I was really happy when we did all those records. Like one of the highlights of my entire career was being able to take those master tapes and go in and remaster all those records. And we took a lot of real time to do that. I felt they came out really well. And I had tons of Thin Lizzy fans, and a lot of the fan clubs and stuff would write and say, like, these are the best-sounding versions of those records that ever came out. So I was really proud of that, because that was something that meant a lot to me, just being a huge Thin Lizzy fan, actually able to make sure the fans actually liked what I liked.
Yeah, well, just to have them on CD was great. I mean, all those 4 records were totally overlooked in America, from Chinatown on, especially Thunder and Lightning. That was completely overlooked in America.
Yeah, I think at that point, too, they just, like John said, the Warner's thing just was not working, because I saw, when we were doing all the licensing stuff, I got to see kind of the business level of where those records were at, how unrecouped they were, and, to Warner's credit, one thing they did that was really awesome is they, because, we had to get approval from everybody, we had to get approval from, the Thin Lizzy camp and everything, and, Warner's actually cool. They said, like, look, in order for you guys to do this, we're going to go ahead and waive the unrecouped balance that these records have, so that everybody gets paid from record one from the records you guys are doing, and that was their unrecouped balance was astronomical.
Oh, really?
Astronomical.
But you know what, you guys? Warner Brothers did a really great job on Live and Dangerous. I mean, they promoted the heck out of it. There was stuff everywhere.
That was Phonogram, wasn't it? Or that came out with Warner Brothers in America?
Yeah, Warner Brothers. Yeah.
That is by far one of the greatest live albums ever.
That's the only one they had in DVD, because it was not quite gold, but it was pretty. I had sold about 400,000 copies when I looked at it.
Right.
It blows me away that that was Live and Dangerous came out in '78, and that was when all after Kiss Alive and Frown to Come to Live and all of these live albums were out there, and it kind of blows me away, because that was the era of the live album, and so many of these people really took off, and that's a great live record. I can't believe that it didn't do more than it really did, which is disappointing.
Yeah, well, that really showed that Thin Lizzy is a hard rock / metal band. I mean, all the songs on that record just kicked ass. And live, they're so much better. A lot of those albums, UFO Live, the Judas Priest Unleashed, the live records were the big thing there, because they just kicked ass over the studio versions. Regardless of, what people say, how much of it was actually done in the studio and it wasn't actually live, I mean, nonetheless, the live versions were usually the ultimate versions as far as, for me growing up, whether it be Priest, Thin Lizzy, Foghat, Kiss, whatever. It's always
all those
UFO. It was always alive.
Bands too.
Absolutely.
A lot of times when you make a live record, you've been playing those songs for 3 or 4 months, and you're really good at it. And you got the song down, and you can just go for it. You don't have to worry about missing a note in the studio.
The only bad thing is a lot of those records were not live records.
Yeah.
Well, I think Live and Dangerous, from what I understand, was more live than not.
Well, you go back and listen to it, you can hear Phil singing backups to himself. Now, that ain't possible, but...
Yeah, exactly.
That's funny, because it kind of broke Huey Lewis. Didn't Huey Lewis do, like, a sax solo on that?
He played harmonica on Baby Drives Me Crazy.
John Earl played saxophone on The Dance in the Moonlight. But if you go back and look at Live and Dangerous, the first special thanks is bluesy Huey Lewis. He was a big Reinhard friend and fan, because Clover, his band from the Bay Area, opened up for Lizzy and over and
And Phil Collins did some percussion on Johnny the Fox, too. I was just reading. I didn't realize.
Yeah.
But we didn't talk about Bad Reputation yet.
Yeah, we should
before we get too far. The record that had all 4 guys on it, but only 3 guys on the cover.
Well, 4 guys on the back, because Robert showed
I know. That's
solos, but you know what I love?
I always wondered about that. Why was that?
Well,
because Brian Roberts. Well, I'll let John tell the story.
Robert Robbo got fired.
Ah.
He got fired, and they were going to try to find somebody else, but they had to record the records, and they wanted to go to Russia, turn them on to something going on over there where they could get a really good deal. So they went over to Canada to make the record, and about halfway through the record, Robbo, wasn't really doing any business with anybody else, and he begged his way back in, and they said, well, come over, playing a couple songs. And if you look at the record, he's kind of treated like a guest on the record, but, he played good enough that he let him back in.
Right.
And then they went on and did Live and Dangerous, and that was his best playing.
Well, yeah, supposedly he also, because he was completely out of control around then, and he really, when they kicked him out and said, that's it, we're doing a record without you, kind of, at least for the short period of time, got him to kind of get his act together at least a little bit.
I interviewed Robbo when he was in Motorhead, and when he left Thin Lizzy, he was really pissed. And then when he got, later on, when Phil died, and his legacy kind of got firmed up, he realized that he was deterred from people. But that hurt the band, having him going in and out of there. That probably hurt the band as much as anything. Because when Gary came in, it just changed the chemistry of the band. It really did. But the one thing that I was going to say, that Live and Dangerous is a great record, but Bad Reputation set that record up. And I remember the day KNAC went out of business. I had to drive to the coast to get the last 2 hours that Lars and James were there to do the going
I
away
remember
party.
that got down.
And I was driving out there, and I didn't know when they were going to go on, but I had done an interview at my house, and then I was driving out there to listen to them, and I hear Armored Saints, Symbol of Salvation. Then I heard Bad Reputation. I go, Lars is there now. Because I knew that, he was into both those bands, and I was happy that he picked up Bad Reputation.
That is one of the most underrated rock metal
Great
tunes.
song.
Man. Amazing
the
song.
Song are amazing. The live version that they do on the White Wild One compilation record from Japan, it's unbelievable.
I haven't heard
I
that.
want to test anybody's stereo. That's the record I take.
So interesting lyrically, too, because it's really a self-portrait of Phil at that particular time.
Yeah, listen to Opium, then
Opium Trail.
Opium Trail, Southbound,
He was starting to mess around with all that stuff at that time.
Yep.
And Gary didn't like it. Gary's like, he has 2 beers and he's out of control, so he didn't like that stuff coming in. He was such a serious musician that, he thought the band was going to crap, because they started messing around with it, but it really, really got bad at Black Rose. Really got bad. That's when the heavy drugs started.
Yeah, and that was a tough time, because, I saw that tour, and they were phenomenal, especially with Gary Moore in the band, but I think, too, you had 2 leaders in one band. It was Phil's band, and you had Gary Moore, who also was used to leading his thing, and I think even though they were great friends, that stuff's going to create conflict anyway.
Well, they got in that infamous fist fight at one of those shows. I think it was at Beyond the Green.
They had a love-hate relationship with each other.
Two Type A personalities. It's going to be tough to get along.
Big time. And it's funny because when Jet Records had Gary and Ozzy signed, but neither one of them had a record, they said, hey, why don't you guys put a band together? And they both said, no, we're both tired of dealing with dictators.
Yeah, Ozzy wanted Gary Moore in the band for quite some time, I remember.
Yeah, but it wouldn't work. I don't think Gary...
I don't think it would have been
I don't think Gary thought that was serious enough.
Yeah, he always wanted to be... Phil's famous line, and he told me this to his face. When they came over for Black Rose, they played the Pasadena Civic. I think I've only seen 3 or 4 shows there. And they had these 3 islands that went out from the stage, and Phil was in the middle one, and Scott was on the right, and Gary was on the left. And Gary kept running over to Phil's island and getting in front of him.
The Black Rose record, too, it's a couple interesting things about that. Obviously, there's Got to Give It Up, which was the definitely autobiographical song, which unfortunately Phil didn't do. But
mother, I'm on junk. I got to get off. And she didn't hear it.
And then Black Rose, which was like one of the first kind of of that time epic, long kind of Queensryche Maiden sort of vibe. And it was 9 minutes long or whatever.
I don't know how anybody can remember that. That's like more notes than Freebird, How can anybody can remember that? I just don't understand.
Well, that was such a great album, and Toughest Street in Town. What a great song! Great lead on that.
Every song on that record is incredible. At that tour, there was 2 things that happened on that tour. Brian Downey did not play that tour. He had to stay home. It was something about his kid being sick. I don't know what it was, but he was out of the band for a while. Mark Nassif, who was Gary's drummer, he went with him. They did that show in Sydney that's really famous.
Oh, that's not Brian Downey playing.
That's Mark Nassif.
I noticed that, yeah.
From Elf, and then he played with Gary on a bunch of records. But after the show, I went backstage, and I had met Phil a couple times before then, but I talked to Phil, and I talked to Scott, and I talked to Gary, and it was funny what they said. I asked Phil what it was like playing with Mark Nassif and not Brian. It was like missing part of his body.
Yeah, well, yeah.
They were connected to the umbilical cord.
And they've been playing
then I
since
went
day
over
one.
to Gary, and I asked Gary, Gary was so funny. I said, Gary, you're replacing Robbo here for the 2nd or 3rd time. Be honest, what do you really think about Robbo as a guitar player? He goes, he's a really good guitar player. He goes, but he uses that fucking wah-wah pedal too much. And I joked, I go, we could always whack off his foot. And he goes, no, I'd still use the stump. he's kind of a witty guy, but he's really him and Phil are different kinds of people.
Well, Chinatown, too, to me, was a really underrated record, too. There's some amazing songs there, like Killer on the Loose and Genocide.
Killer on the Loose, they were pushing that as a single, and they had a great video. He's walking down the alley in that trench coat and everything.
Yeah,
awesome. They were going to get a push and have a hit song, and then all of a sudden there's a serial murderer, and they're accusing Phil of writing the song about that guy. And everybody knows you record albums 3 or 4 months before they come out. Come on.
Right.
He didn't even know about that guy, but they just try to pin it, and the single died. It's just typical Thin Lizzy luck.
Yeah, exactly. Typical Thin Lizzy luck of all time.
And Snowy, Vivian Campbell told me a story once. They were supporting, what was his band, Sweet Savage?
Yeah.
They were supporting Thin Lizzy in an Irish tour during Chinatown, and he said Snowy White was the only guitar player I ever saw wear a watch on stage and look at it.
Yeah. He was really, he was in the
clock, and I'm at work, and he said he came off the stage, and he'd seen Vivian playing. He knew Vivian was a great player. He took his Gold Cop Les Paul, and he handed it to Vivian, and he says, "You want a gig?" And Vivian said it was the hardest thing he ever did, not to go on stage. He wanted to do it, but he was afraid that if he went on, Phil would be so pissed that he wouldn't get a shot once they kicked Snowy out.
Yeah.
And he wanted.
You can really tell too when you see videos. There's a lot. Around the time that Snowy's in the band, there's probably more video of that than almost any other incarnation of Thin Lizzy. And while being a great player, you could tell he just did not want to be on that stage.
He's a blues guy.
It's like, I'll do my thing and I'm out of here.
Well, I heard something that he wanted to sit on a stool when they played live.
That wouldn't surprise me.
That's true. It's true, and it's funny because Scott told me once that when they had Midge Ure in the band, that Midge Ure was wearing this yellow jumpsuit with all these orange bubbles on it. And Scott goes, if he goes out there he's going on stage with that on, I ain't going out there. And Phil goes, if he goes on stage wearing that stuff, I'm more proud of him.
Anyway, Midge Ure of Ultravox, and those early Ultravox records are great.
Oh,
did he play with Thin Lizzy?
Yeah.
Midge Ure, he played quite a bit. He was really, really good friends with Phil.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah,
and he was kind of in and out of the band quite a bit, actually.
Yeah, he played keyboards on a couple of records. He was always on Phil's solo records. There was actually a time when Scott wasn't in the band. Scott missed a few shows, and they had Midge Ure and a guy named Dale Fleet. And Midge learned Live and Dangerous on the headphones on an airplane.
Yeah, Midge Ure played guitars on a lot of the earlier stuff. So
he's in fact, remember that there was a single collection, like a little EP, and they were going to play Whiskey in the Jar, and he goes, they never played that with the 2 guitar guys. What they did, it was rare. And he looks around and he goes, Snowy doesn't know it, Scott doesn't know it, but Midge over here, he knows it. And he ended up playing, Whiskey in the Jar with Thin Lizzy. So he was a great musician, incredible musician.
Yeah, phenomenal. That early Ultravox stuff was, even though it's not really metal, it was predicated on metal. I think the way they wrote it was awesome stuff.
Very percussive.
Wow.
Yeah.
They're one of the guys that techno would just lean heavily upon to figure out how to make records. But Thin Lizzy, that's the one thing that they could do. And if Phil wanted to go make a techno song or play with the punks, they'd let him.
Yeah.
He could do anything.
He was very popular with the punk rock people.
Well, the Reedies, remember they did that single with Scott and all the Sex Pistols guys?
Yeah.
But he looked kind of punk rock. And you talk about the Maiden correlation, too. If you look at the way Phil looked and then the way Di'Anno looked in the early days, Di'Anno was kind of stealing Phil's look quite a bit.
Right.
So, talking about, metal, I think Renegade is probably, that was the time where it seemed like Thin Lizzy had to really become more of a metal band because that's what was really popular, especially in the UK at that point. So that's when you got, the heavier of Angel of Death. And
it was 1981, so you're right, yeah. But they still also, you got a song like Fats on it, and you got
Blood, and plenty of other stuff.
Which was always the great thing about Thin Lizzy. They always, had so much diversity in every single record. It was just all over the place, and I think that probably hurt them more than it helped them. But, for true music fans, it was just amazing to hear,
Yeah, but those first 6 songs on that record were, phenomenal, really heavy. The first 6 songs are just crushing heavy on that.
Yeah, that's true.
I like the title song the best, and that's the only song that Snowy wrote. Renegade is half Snowy, half Phil.
Yeah, it's a great song.
I don't think Snowy's much of a renegade at all. I think he wrote he wrote a lot of the music and how mellow that stuff is before it kicks in, but you listen to that's another autobiographical song where Phil's just telling you what he's done.
Well, I find it really interesting about that record, too, that Leave This Town is right before Hollywood. Some subtle message there as well, I think.
Well, Hollywood is really Scott's song. Scott, talked about, that was his thing, because he's from Glendale. Right on top of right on top of Hollywood. And so, that's funny. Remember how Phil used to always introduce Scott Gorham as the next president of the United States of America?
Yep, either that or all the way from the USA.
Yeah, from Los Angeles, wherever that is.
Los Angeles, yeah.
Well, it's funny because, you mentioned about Phil hanging out the Rainbow and the Starwood. He loved Hollywood, from what I heard. He was totally in
Party Town.
Hollywood, yeah.
John, the Boys Are Back in Town, that song was written all over. Everybody says it's a song about the Manchester United football team and stuff like that, but there's pieces and parts that come from everywhere. You know the line where if the boys want to fight, you better let them?
Right.
Supposedly a pool ball landed in his soup when he was eating at Barney's Beanery and a fight broke out, and that's where he got that verse from. And he was thinking for a place down at Dino's Bar and Grill, and he went, but he was driving...
Was that an actual place, Dino's?
It's actually a bar that was between Barney's Beanery and where he was staying at the Sunset Marquis.
Oh, really?
It's called Dino's. So he changed it to Dino's Bar and Grill. And so, he picked up stuff all the time. And the thing about Phil that I thought made him so unique was he was black, but he was Irish.
Mm.
He was the mellow poet, and he was the Johnny the Fox, the rocker. He runs the band from the bass position. But what does everybody think about Thin Lizzy? Dual guitars.
Yeah. Well, that is a shame because lyrically, like you say, I mean, that's the thing I appreciate a lot more now because, you listen to it, when you're a kid, you want to hear, the heavy lyrics and all that. But you just got to admire the fact that, everything was just about the neighborhood and, Johnny the Fox meets Jimmy the Weed. I mean, so many of these songs were just cool. Dan McCafferty wrote a lot of that kind of stuff. So did Ian Gillan and Alex Harvey.
He paints a picture. That's the one.
Exactly.
Any great songwriter or poet, they paint a picture, and you can see that picture in your mind.
Exactly. You just like a total story, and you could just visualize everything he says.
One thing that I see coming from the writing aspect is the way I think a lot. Phil wrote songs like the way Hemingway wrote novels. He was a very stark writer. He didn't use a lot of words, which is why Boys Are Back in Town is kind of unusual. That's his most wordy song. If you go back and listen to the lyrics, he sings a lot. Whereas if you look into Emerald, that's only an 8-line poem. Phil would use the words to make it work for the song, but he was not a very wordy writer. But he would say things that are so genius, like, where he says, right, quite right. It's W-R-I-T-E. Q-U-I-T-E-R-I-G-H-T. Genius. Who could think of that?
Yeah, well, that's the, again, the music is, of course, phenomenal, but absolute pure genius of the way he was writing that stuff. And like I said, just little things like that are just phenomenal. And I'm also fascinated by the real autobiographical stuff where he really let you into his life. And you really see kind of how messed up things were and, how he's trying to make it right. But he's almost reaching out for help that he just never was able to get.
He was, and he was very sentimental doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Hetfield is massively influenced by Thin Lizzy and definitely Phil. And I think, if you look at the last couple Hetfield records before, Metallica records before he went in to get, to kind of get himself right. You look at those lyrics, I mean, he's really reaching out as well. Very similar to the way Lionel was. And I think that's a pure indication of just what a heavy influence that he had even on Metallica lyrically as well.
So, Brian, did you see the show that where Kiss opened up for Thin Lizzy and had 10 feet of stage?
No. I heard about it, though.
There was a show at Long Beach Arena, and the headliner was Wishbone Ash. Thin Lizzy played in the middle, and Kiss, God bless them, they came out and they played with about 8 to 10 feet of the stage.
So it must have been 75, so it's a little too early for me, unfortunately.
They didn't have half the stuff. They had a few, firebombs and like that. They didn't have half the stuff they came up with later, but it was kind of fun.
Wow. I never knew Wishbone Ash was that big in the States, where they actually had...
Oh, God. Wishbone Ash would have been huge, but they ran into the same problem that Thin Lizzy did. They had a record called Argus in 1972, which set in 71. It was voted Album of the Year in England and Europe. It was a phenomenal record, and it was double platinum here. It was a huge record.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
They didn't have any radio hits at all, but, FM radio could break bands, touring in FM radio could break bands. I mean, they headlined all over. They headlined the Palladium, they headlined Santa Monica, they headlined Long Beach, and they were about ready to be an arena band, and they were coming over doing 6,000-seaters, and when they were in Memphis, their entire truck with all their guitars, and Andy Powell had 4 of the original 150 Flying V's. They were on that truck, and all their equipment was stolen, and they had to go back, and it took a chunk out of their career.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
stuff like
because they were kind of breaking in some of the Midwestern spots, too, like in Detroit, and a lot of those areas that were really kind of breaking a lot of the rock stuff around there.
Well, it's funny, because when you talk to people, Steve Harris, people like that, they always cite Thin Lizzy and Wishbone Ash for the whole dual guitar. In fact, a lot of people say that Thin Lizzy got that from Wishbone Ash.
They didn't. They all got it. They all came about it independently, but they all used it differently. And like I said, like Brian's point about they're playing, both guys are playing the same thing at the same time. We got to remember they're both playing Les Pauls and both going through huge amps.
Right.
So it just sounds like everyone in the world's playing that riff. It's just so powerful. Wishbone Ash was never powerful.
Well, they were more progressive, weren't they?
Not really. I mean, they were, sometimes they were very bluesy.
Yeah, kind of southern. They kind of reminded me of like a a little bit of a different version of the Allman Brothers. The same sort of a vibe, a little bit.
Yeah, they were Allman Brothers, and you can link Wishbone Ash and Allman Brothers way easier than you can link Thin Lizzy to either one of those bands.
That's very true.
So, I mean,
But like I said,
I think Thin Lizzy stands on its own. You know, when you look about it, the poetic black frontman who plays bass, and then they got the two guitars. I mean, the band it's such a unique setup, and now it's commonplace. When you take a setup that's unusual and make it the norm, that's incredible.
Yep. That's
absolutely
changed. It changed the face of music, really.
Yeah, Van Halen did that. You get a guitar player who plays completely different than the way anybody else ever plays. You know, everybody plays like him. You know, Phil never got his due. I mean, he was just such a lovely guy, talented songwriter. He just
great bass player too. Amazing.
To say he wasn't as good as he should have been, but he's really good.
But I think he was an incredible bass player. But he was also smart enough to know that, like, look, this band is about these two guitars, and I'm going to sit here and you got this great drummer and these two amazing guitar players. I'm going to keep down the rhythm and do it that way and be simple and let those guys be the stars. I think he was smart enough in his songwriting to realize that if he's trying to be Steve Harris, it's not going to work.
You look at Boys Are Back in
great
Town,
bass
and he does all those jazz riffs, you know, and then, you know, on Emerald and Warrior, he plays right along with the guys. He plays whatever the song takes.
And there's some songs that he plays on bass that are it's simple, but it's not that easy to play, especially the way the music is going as well.
You know, going back, I just found out recently on Black Rose, Jimmy Bain played some bass on that.
Yeah.
Yep. And of course, Jimmy and Brian Robertson ended up doing Wild Horses.
Jimmy played all over Phil's solo records.
Right.
And they were really good friends. Problem with Jimmy is Jimmy used to get Phil a lot of crap.
Yeah.
Bad stuff.
They were not the best combination in terms of partying.
They were just, gasoline and a torch,
No, what is this? In 1981, they did the Killers and the Killers Live 2. What were those? I'm not familiar with those.
Well, Killers was like a EP that had a bunch of live stuff on it.
Was that released in the States or just in Europe?
Japanese. It was a Japanese EP.
Ah.
It had Stop Messing Around, Killer on the Loose. They were all wearing trench coats on the EP. I have that. It's a gatefold single. They got, I think it's just 4 or 6 songs, and then everything gets repackaged. I just try to remember the original catalog, and then the other stuff just a compliment. But I have every song that Thin Lizzy's ever put out officially. I have, plus all the bootlegs and all those other things. When I had those meetings with Warner Brothers, they talked about putting the greatest hits together, and I said, why don't you just let the catalog stay as it is? Because I don't think the kids want you to mess with history.
Now they do it all the time.
They work better that way to let the catalog come all the way out on CD. Now it's fun to put the compilations together and put out rarities. And if something pops up like that UK show, Fighting, hey, just God bless you, there's more good stuff to listen to.
So shall we get into Thunder and Lightning?
Sure.
1983. Jon Sykes comes in, replaces Snowy White.
Well, the story behind that record is Sangarides, because Sangarides did Renegade.
Right.
And also Sangarides did Gary Moore's live record and Phil's solo.
And he also did Tigers of Pantang, that Jon Sykes.
Right, and he did a ton of stuff. But he also did, Gary Moore was doing Back in the Streets when Phil was doing a solo record, and Phil was broke, and Gary had a good budget, so Phil would come in when Gary was sleeping and keep Chris awake 24 hours a day. But Chris was really responsible for getting a lot of that sound and urging him.
And he's a great guy, too, by the way, Chris.
Well, I managed him for 2 years. When
I remember you invited me over. We went out to lunch with him one day.
He's
great guy.
Sweet guy.
Real sweet guy.
He's really talented, and he's got some of the best gear on earth, and he's got all the old stuff that people don't have that still works. Plus, he can really play. But anyways, Chris, urged them to get heavier, and it wasn't hard because here's Sykes, a brand new kid in a band that's pretty much mature, and he comes in with all this energy, and come on, Cold Sweat, what a great song.
That whole album, I think, is just amazing.
I think what that album did is I think it taught the little kids, because the young guys coming up, hey, we still got it. You got to be at least this good, or you're not going to make it.
But it still had that same Thin Lizzy style, though. I mean, that's the thing about it. They always kept that style. They were able to make their sound more modern. I mean, you listen to the title track, Thunder and Lightning, but it always had that identity, that Thin Lizzy, which they always awesome.
Yeah, but you're right about Sangarides, because he definitely was kind of pushing them in the heavier direction, and then Sykes coming in was the perfect guy at that time.
Absolutely.
And people forget that record was really big in Europe.
Oh, yeah.
And the band was not have been the biggest they had ever been in Europe around that time.
I heard they only did like 20,000 or so in the States.
It did nothing.
It did nothing. But they headlined Reading again because of that record.
Right.
And you look at Sangarides' life thing. Remember he did Painkiller, and he made Priest get heavy again. I mean, that's kind of his MO. But I was so when Thunder and Lightning came out, when it was a gatefold record and it had all those B-sides, I couldn't have been happier. And I knew that was going to be their last record because Scott told me that they didn't tell Sykes, but that was it. That they weren't going to do anything after that. They were done. Scott wanted to get clean. They were both, him and Phil were both, doing heroin. It was really ugly. They couldn't keep it together, and they weren't making any any money. So,
yeah, that was the big problem. They were definitely spending a lot of money, but they weren't making a lot of money back then.
But I'll tell you what, though, that record, there's not a bad song on that record.
I think I listened to it. I wouldn't say it's my favorite record, but I think it's definitely my most listened to Thin Lizzy record.
Wow.
Well, it's certainly the most modern sounding. When you got to '83, and that kind of the whole metal scene was becoming huge again. So great sounding record for sure.
I mean, look who they had to compete with at that time. Who was coming on the scene? Accept, Metallica, Anthrax, and Lizzy. They always were very competitive.
And you got to remember, Sangarides, he did a lot of those. He did Tigers of Panda, he did Anvil, he did a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, Girl School. So he was really familiar with that kind of sound. I think you're right. He probably did add a lot.
Oh, absolutely. And he's one of the big reasons why Sykes got in the band as well, aside from Sykes being Irish.
There was a troubled time for Lizzy, but they made a great record.
And what's interesting is one of my favorite leads of Thin Lizzy is The Sun Goes Down, and for the longest time I always thought that was John Sykes, and that's a Scott Gorham lead.
Oh, no,
and that's one of my favorite. I love that lead in that
there's
song.
There's an EP that has 3 different versions of that song. So, there's one with a bunch of flamenco guitar. It's really incredible. It's just The Sun Goes Down EP, and they got 3 different versions of that song.
Wow, I got to get that, because that's one of my favorite songs. That and Holy War, too. I love that tune.
Well, Sun Goes Down, he's really, that's another autobiographical song. I mean, Phil's thinking about him and his band's mortality.
What's funny is, I don't know if you've heard the story, or if really anyone has, but Jonas Hansen, right, from Silver Mountain, he actually told me that Thin Lizzy's manager at the time, this was after Thunder and Lightning, I guess Phil was going to reform Thin Lizzy, and Sykes was already gone. He said the manager had called up Jonas, because apparently Phil had heard Jonas's plan from somewhere, and had him come out to England, and he was going to meet with Phil, and I guess at that time Phil was in the hospital, and he said, well, go back to Sweden and we'll give you a call.
Yeah, there was always a lot of reports. I mean, back in the news back then, I remember, reading, all Kerrang and Sounds and all that stuff, and, even beyond that, there's always news about Thin Lizzy reforming, and there's all these rumors out there, and, I think a lot of it was, I'm sure there was truth to a lot of it, but, who knows? I think at that point Phil was so sick that, he had to get himself together before that would happen, and unfortunately didn't. By the way, I'm an idiot. John Sykes is English. I don't know why I said Irish earlier.
No, he's English.
I know that. Sykes is a fantastic.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. I didn't know. I know Vivian
I was thinking for a second about Vivian Campbell.
Right.
I don't why I got those two confused.
It's
I don't know.
funny because when Vivian wanted the Thin Lizzy job and Sykes got it, he used to call John Sykes John Sucks.
Yeah.
but John's a great guitar player and a good guy. We've hung around.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Great,
of course, he's kept the band going and still going.
Yeah, Scott was reluctant in the beginning, but when John just wanted to do it so bad, Scott just deferred to him and said, "Okay, let's go play those songs."
I think the first time they did was pretty cool.
I thought so too. I think they kind of milked it a bit, but it was great to see him because, like I said, that was the first time I've never saw Thin Lizzy with Phil. So
I went to the Vibe for Philo, the number 10 anniversary, which is really the best one. A couple guys from Def Leppard played. A bunch of guys came up and played. Eric Bell played. All these guys are really great, phenomenal. They did the '94 thing, and I'd seen it, but to see it in Ireland, they left the microphone empty at the front of the stage, just and nobody went near it. And just like this is where Phil would have been. And Sykes played around it, and they just played a great show. And at the end of the show, Sykes just looked skyward while he was bleeding the last notes of Black Rose, and he just said, "To the greatest rocker that ever lived, Phil Lynott."
Absolutely. Hey, John, have you been over and seen the statue yet?
Yeah, I got a picture of it. I've been there.
Yeah, I haven't been there yet. I'm dying to go, though.
But
awesome.
every year on January 4th, they do the Vibe for Philo, and it's kind of watered down, and a lot of guys don't go there, but, I went there, and it's crazy because I went to that one in '96, and, I'd been to Sykes' house a few times. He lives in my hometown, Northridge, and I used to go over there every once in a while. And I walked into this bar after the show, and Sykes looked at me and goes, "I knew you would be here." And then Scott said hi, and this is a funny story, guys. You'll laugh your ass off. I had told a bunch of people that I was going over there to the show, and I said, if you want something, just give me money. I had $700 of other people's money in my back pocket. I had instructions from Joey Vera T-shirt. All these guys.
Yeah, I remember you did that. I think I asked for something.
Yeah, I got a couple T-shirts. And Bailey wanted this and wanted that. I go there, and they have this big press meeting with all these people from all over the world meeting the band, and I said, I don't need that. I've done that. I know them all. I got half their phone numbers at home. Anyways, who cares? So I went to the show, and I bought so much stuff that by the time the press guys got there, all the stuff was gone because I bought it. And I had 7 copies of Philomena's book, My Boy, in that bag. And I go to the bar, and Philomena, if she sees me and somebody points, that's the guy you got to meet. So she comes over, and she gives me a copy of the book. I got 7 of these in my bag. I didn't say anything. I kept the one she gave me.
Right.
But it was just so amazing that they had re-released Thin Lizzy's Greatest Hits. It was #1 there. Her book was #1. They were being played on the radio, and it was like Thin Lizzy was in their prime. Everybody was wearing T-shirts. Everybody was wearing jackets. I never got to see that.
Well, that's the sad thing is their popularity really increased tenfold after after Phil had passed.
Yeah,
but that, that happens all the time.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of funny.
It doesn't happen here yet. There's so many bands I hear now. You listen to new bands like Glider and this Bandwagon, a lot of bands, and they all have that real distinct Thin Lizzy sound, which I think is cool. That a lot of bands.
You'll be surprised though how many. Even these new crop of metal bands. I talk to these bands all the time, and they're all big Thin Lizzy fans. Just for an example, Phil, this guitar player from As I Dying, and Nick, both of them are massive Thin Lizzy fans. And they first really, and they're young kids. When they first started really getting into it, I was giving them all these obscure compilations of all this stuff, and they're huge fans. And if you listen to, even if you listen to As I Dying's music, there's definitely a lot of Thin Lizzy overtones in their dual leads and a lot of the other stuff. And a lot of these bands that are happening now are all going back and really, researching the history of metal all the way back to stuff like Thin Lizzy, and especially the guitar players that all hear that just go like, man, they were amazing. Stuff they were doing is just really phenomenal. And look at the commercials. Jailbreak and The Boys Are Back in Town are probably in 3 or 4 massive commercials now.
Oh, yeah.
So it's definitely, it's more and more, I find that more people actually know about it, are Thin Lizzy fans now than they were when they were around, like in the late 70s and early 80s. Back then, people go like, who's, what? Thin Lizzy? I don't know anything about them. Everybody knows who they are now, even in the States.
Well, like you said, with Metallica
growing.
Yeah, even Metallica doing a Whiskey in the Jar. A lot of people have gone back, and that's really influenced a lot of the younger musicians that were huge Metallica fans to go back and check out old Thin Lizzy.
And they might be the only band that, Metallica's done covers, Iron Maiden's done covers, the biggest bands in metal of all time. Probably the only band that they've all done covers of that are the same. Maybe it might be Thin Lizzy.
True.
Guns N' Roses. Go on and on.
A lot of people haven't heard of Thin Lizzy, but I don't know anybody that's heard them that doesn't like them.
No, absolutely. But it's definitely becoming more and more, and I think with this new crop of metal kids coming up who are really into the history of it and stuff, you start to see, more and more how people are more getting into it. And I know that, some of the catalog sales, especially iTunes stuff, is increasing for what they're doing. So the awareness is definitely getting bigger, that's for sure.
I'll tell you what, you guys, I've never seen a band better live.
I just saw them twice, and they were phenomenal. It's definitely, of the 1,000 or so concerts I've ever seen, those 2 shows, I remember, I could visually watch them in my head again.
What were those shows, Brian? That was
it was in Long Beach, opening for Journey.
And that was with Gary Moore.
1975. Yeah, Gary Moore, 1979.
Wow. And then the other time was...
They played 2 shows with Journey.
Oh, okay.
And that was it, unfortunately.
Well, that was the only time I ever remember them playing out in the West Coast. Of course, you had seen them way back in the day, I guess, John, but...
Well, they played...
that was the last time they played the West Coast, I think.
I think so.
They didn't come back. They didn't come back after Chinatown. They played... The first time they made L.A., they played the Santa Monica Civic opening for Journey before Steve Perry. And I stuck my camera and took pictures from the front row. The next time they came back, they headlined Santa Monica Civic and played with Graham Parker. And then they came back, they came with Queen, and they played the Forum. And a lot of people, that was their first show.
What year was the Queen show?
77.
Yeah. I saw Queen, I think, the following year. I missed the 77 show.
It was phenomenal, because that was the first backstage pass I ever got, because I started writing for Record Review in 76, and by 77 I started to get a couple perks. And I went up, because back in those days it was an hour between shows all the time. They didn't have their equipment together like they do nowadays. And Thin Lizzy played, and I went into the Forum Club, the Forum Club now, and that was the first time I ever saw sushi. I think Freddie Mercury flew it over from Japan,
Wow.
But all the guys, I got to talk to all 4 guys in Thin Lizzy, went back out, watched Queen, came back again, and they were all in there hanging out.
Awesome.
Just normal guys, just sit down, have a beer, and what's going on.
That's great.
I've got to know those guys over the years, and it's funny because I went to see them 2 years ago for the Vibe for Pillow number 20, and I was walking into the hotel. I walked in the hotel, and I do what I always do. I go change in my running gear, and I'm walking down the staircase in my running shorts and a tank top, and Robbo looks at me, and he sticks out his hands and says, "Hey, how you doing? What's going on?" He doesn't know my name. He knows my face. So I go out and I do my run, and I come back. I go in the bar to get something to eat, and these 2 girls come over and start chatting me up, and I go, "Who do you guys think I am?" And they go, "Well, Robbo told us that you were Roger Waters from Pink Floyd." And I look over, and he's just laughing his ass off.
What's funny, isn't Snowy White playing with Roger Waters, or he did some touring with him?
He's gone back and played with him.
Right.
Yeah.
That is hilarious.
Wall is Roger Waters, so when they became Pink Floyd, he was a Roger guy, so it would make more sense for him to play with Roger than it would be to play with Pink Floyd.
Another thing I didn't know, that Scott Gorham played on Pat Travers' Putting It Straight record.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow, great record.
I think Scott is so underrated, you guys. He plays so good. I can hear Scott Gorham in Slash.
Oh, totally. Well, I mean, he was the mainstay of the whole band, and he definitely never got the. I mean, just like the whole band never got their due. He never got their due, and I think a lot of the times when there's two guitar players in a band, they just don't get the respect as if it's one guitar player. I mean, even look at Iron Maiden. I mean, Dave Murray and Adrian Smith, to me, are two of the best guitar players ever in the history of music, and not that many people really look at them like that.
No, you're right. You're right.
Two guitar players, so they can't really pick them out. It's not like, Tony Iommi, Randy Rhoads, Eddie Van Halen. He's on this one guitar player in the band. You're just going to naturally get much more of that adulation than you do if there's two. And that's part of the thing, part of it is being Thin Lizzy being, kind of an underground sensation, more or less.
Plus, I think they were...
Scott being one of the two guitar team. But yeah, I mean, as a player, he was phenomenal.
Nobody was a dominant player. They were both equals. They complemented each other. It's not like the Young Brothers where Malcolm only plays rhythm and Angus is the star. I mean, they're equals in every way.
Exactly.
They're equals in every way. They just have a different style that just really works together.
Yep, and they kind of split the vote, so...
Yep.
And plus, they're very tasty. They didn't have the flash of, like, the Eddie Van Halens or a lot of the people that they go for.
They played in the wired-in era. They couldn't run around wired up, with all the stuff that they have today. I mean, they had chords all the time.
Right.
But you listen to a lot of those leads, though, and there's some really intricate guitar work going on at an early stage. I mean, they were doing some pretty amazing stuff in the mid '70s, where there wasn't a lot of that real flashy playing. I mean, Blackmore and those sort of people for sure.
But again, it wasn't like you said blues. So many of the guitar players were more bluesy, where they really took from the whole folky kind of side. And same with like Rory Gallagher, another great Irish player, or Gary Moore. Although Gary Moore did a lot of the bluesy stuff, but they had more of a very, very unique style that.
Well, that Irish folk music kind of bleeds well into the kind of style that metal is. So I look at Black Rose. It's just an Irish folk song that's kind of reworked, but it sounds so good with hearing it being played on electric guitars, and just kind of led into that. And I'm sure Phil had some influence. And plus, you got a guy like Scott Gorham that wasn't really a blues player.
If you listen to Roy Gallagher and you hear Out on the Western Plain, that's a country riff. I mean,
a lot of it is very country.
A lot of American country and western is based on Irish, so they're on the other side. They're not on the blues side of the equation. They're more on the folk kind of countryish kind of side. They really are.
That's a good point. No, that's true.
And Phil is the only one that really has any influence beyond that. I mean, the other guys, they were influenced by the English bands, not by the American blues bands. Gary's a complete Peter Green guy. That's his head. That's his stuff right there.
Now, they did a lot of shows with the early Fleetwood Mac, Peter Green era, didn't they, back then?
Yeah, they did. And, and then they were friends. And, Gary had, I think he still owns Peter Green's Sunburst at Les Paul.
Well, all that early Thin Lizzy stuff was definitely more into the early Fleetwood Mac style anyway, so it made sense for them to be doing shows together.
Fleetwood Mac would play blues, and then they'd play pop. Thin Lizzy never played blues. They just played rock.
Yep.
And then if they did anything else, they would get heavy, or they'd do a ballad, but they didn't do anything that was really, really bluesy. I mean, the closest thing they have to a blues song is "I'm Still in Love with You," and that's really a ballad more than it's a blues song. And I bet I've heard 30 different versions of that song, and I never get tired of it.
That's a great song.
It's a great song.
Well, I probably listen to Thin Lizzy more at this point than anything else. Even today, one thing that's really interesting about music and what's going to stand the test of time, and that's to me another thing that's just so phenomenal about what Phil and Thin Lizzy did, is that stuff sounds just as good, if not better, now than it did when it came out. And that's saying a lot of stuff. Like I go back and listen to a lot of stuff, even some of the new wave of British heavy metal stuff that I worshipped as a kid. And I mean, it's good, but it doesn't stand up like a lot of other stuff that still stands up now. Certainly Thin Lizzy.
Well, that's the definition of classic, is the fact that it stands the test of time. Thin Lizzy's always going to sound good. It's all free is always going to sound good.
Well, it's great songs, man.
Yeah.
I equate Thin Lizzy to a fine bottle of red French wine. It gets better with age.
Well, for me particularly, because like I said, when I grew up, of course you're a few years older, John, but I grew up on the new wave of British heavy metal. Even before then, the metal, Judas Priest, AC/DC, UFO. I was always into the heavier stuff. So when Thin Lizzy were at their prime, 76, and I was more into the other band. But going back now, I mean, I think I listen to them more than any of those bands.
Well, you guys, when the new wave of British heavy metal came out, I was 29 years old, and I knew those records sounded crappy. I could hear the songs were good, but I kept saying, like I heard the Diamond Head stuff, I go, what? When they get a producer, everything will be fine. But they just didn't sound that great to me, and I was a snob. I was listening to UFO and Thin Lizzy and and
Yeah, well, I listened to all that stuff too, but I also love the new wave of British heavy metal.
But you're right about the production. I mean, what was kind of cool about the new wave of British heavy metal was very underground, and most of those demos and those singles and stuff, they were recorded basically in their garage. It wasn't,
Well, also, that was kind of the second coming, too, because, like, by 79, most of the bands, you know, UFO, Priest, Sabbath, Thin Lizzy, they had all kind of, you know, Kiss, AC/DC were kind of all, well, not really AC/DC as much, but, I mean, Bon Scott was dying. But they were all kind of coming to a place where what they were putting out wasn't that exciting, and then the new wave of British heavy metal came along,
all
and
on
they were a
their
little bit
10th
different.
record, you know, so people know who they are. When they did live, I heard about Live a year before it happened. I was up in San Francisco doing some stuff with Rush and Triumph, you know, stories I was writing, and Ross Halfin was there. And I didn't know him very well. I'd met him a couple of times, and he told me that Phil was going to get all those guys together on the stage, and I go, whoa. And I really didn't think it was possible that Gary Moore would play with Eric Bell or Robbo would come back, because Robbo had said such bad things about, you know, Thin Lizzy's management and Phil after he got sacked. I just didn't think it would happen, you know, and then when it did, I was absolutely, completely blown away. I thought the record was very good. Scott thinks it's very tired.
I don't like it as much as Live and Dangerous, not near as much.
No, it's not as great a record, you know, and it feels kind of slipped a little bit. But there's a lot of sentiment in that record, a lot of sentimentality, and, you know, all those guys getting back there, and you look at the songs, and the fact that they all love Phil dearly enough that they'd all come back just said a lot for him. But, you know, it's funny, the picture on the back, Gary's got his head down, and he's just burning, and everybody's looking at Gary. Like, what is he doing?
You know, Ross Halfin's got some amazing Thin Lizzy stories, too. Like, you know, since I never got to meet or hang around with them, it's always try to find people that know them and, like, tell me some stories. And Ross has great, awesome Thin Lizzy stories about Phil. And, you know, he said the same thing that John said, just a really, just kind-hearted, really genuine guy who, you know, liked to party a little bit too much. Very similar to Bon Scott, really. All the stories I hear about both of those guys, the same, you know, adjectives come up over and over again.
How did you guys hear that Phil died? And because the first thing I heard was on MTV, I remember Mark Goodman, the curly-haired guy, saying that Phil Lynott had been taken to the hospital in a coma, and he looked like he had just swallowed a bullet. He just looked in shock.
Well, John, you'll remember this. This was one of the weirdest days ever. So I heard about it in the morning when it first broke, and I was set to go into the studio that day because we were working with Sound Barrier.
That's right, I remember this.
And I got to the studio that day, and they had no idea. Like, I had heard somebody called me from Europe in the morning, or some had told me. So I go to the studio, and what are they recording? Hollywood by Thin Lizzy that day.
Right, I remember that. It
was so bizarre. They had no clue, no idea. I didn't even know they were doing that song. I just went in the studio because I was scheduled to be there to hear some of the mixes and stuff, and I walked in, and they were recording that track, and I go, wow, this is really weird, guys. I got to tell you what happened. And that was pretty intense.
Because I remember when we were talking about making that record, they brought up Phil as a producer. They wanted to work with the guy.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Bernie was a huge...
I remember Mark Ferrari told me, Mark called me, I was always really good friends with him, and he called me and told me, and I just went to a park and sat down and cried. You know, because I didn't think he was that sick. You know, I heard stories about Gary going around to his flat a month before he died, and he hadn't been outside in forever, and his place was a dump, and he was hanging out with all these druid kind of guys who were just doing really nasty
stuff. Yeah, he kind of faded from view, because, like, you know, Thin Lizzy had broken up, and he'd kind of done these, you know, solo records, and, you know, he kind of just kind of faded away a little bit. Nobody really knew what was going on. You'd hear these rumors about, you know, Thin Lizzy kind of getting back together, or he was going to do something, but you didn't really think too much about it. You just thought, well, he's just kind of, you know, hibernating for a while, and, you know, he may or may not come back and do some sort of music. And we always hope for a Thin Lizzy reunion, but I think, I remember distinctly, maybe a month or two before that, there were rumors about the Thin Lizzy thing, and I remember him coming out and saying, there's not ever going to be another Thin Lizzy, and he was kind of real adamant about it.
He said
everybody's kind of bummed out.
He said in the press that if Thin Lizzy ever reforms, it's because he needs money.
Yeah, something like that, but he's real adamant about it. It was kind of like, whoa, that's kind of interesting. And then, yeah, just maybe a couple months later it was the end.
You know, when VH1 got around to making the Thin Lizzy documentary, I knew they'd call me, and I knew I'd get into the equation somehow, but I didn't know what. But when Chrissy Shannon, who used to work at Geffen and I knew pretty well, called me up, I said, well, I'm coming down with everything. So I went down there with every record, every T-shirt, every article, everything I had, and I just gave it all to, you know, MTV and just let them do what they did. And I kind of wrote out, you know, what I thought they should do for, like, you know, what are the highlights of the career and stuff. And I really wasn't that interested in being on camera because there was other people that were way more important in the equation than me, but I really wanted them to make it kind of a love story about him and his mom, but also really be faithful to the music and how much they influenced everybody. And they didn't do that. They kept the mom thing in there, and they played up the tragedy of the story, and they did the Hollywood thing, but they didn't let everybody know how influential that band really was.
I agree.
Yeah,
that really you in an hour, but still, you're right. For an hour.
Yeah, that drove me crazy too, because I was in, you know, like John, you know, both of us were really involved in that whole thing, and, you know, I had hooked them up with so many different people, and, you know, getting them, you know, as much stuff as we could get them, and, you know, we did a lot of stuff for them for that special. hoping that that's what they were going to do. It's like when it first came out, it's like, wow, this is really great, because a whole bunch of us have been lobbying this forever.
Right.
So when I finally got the call they were going to do it, I was so happy. I'm like, this is awesome, and they really came out. And Christy's great, by the way. She's still doing really well. I have a lot of respect for her. She always apologized profusely for the end result there, but they really in the initial thing, that's what they wanted to do. And like I said earlier, they had footage from Hetfield, from Axl, from Bono, from all the guys from Def Leppard. They had stuff from all the other behind the music. So I saw it, and they had put it together. And originally that was going to be the very end of the story, was going to be all the influences, and then it became this whole melodramatic thing at the end.
That's MTV and that's VH1. It's all about the
Well, that's what they did. Well, VH1 at the time, they saw the original edit with all the influential stuff, and they said, that's not that interesting. We much prefer this, tragic story and tearjerkers kind of nonsense. And that's what they ended up doing, and it just ended up, the first 45 minutes of that was really good, and then the last 15 minutes was just a waste.
Yeah, well, that's how, unfortunately, all the behind the musics have been. It's all based on the tragedies of the artists.
Well, and that was when they were churning them out. It was such a huge thing. They had to just churn them out so quickly that they didn't. The first ones were really good because they had so much time to really delve in and get it together and do it. It was like a cookie cutter thing. It's like, okay, done, quick, done, fast. And
you know what they should have done
so quickly
on Thin Lizzy, instead of the behind the music kind of thing? I don't know if you remember when they were doing Legends. They did one on Zeppelin. They did one on Queen. Yeah, those were great because that was based on the band, their history, their influence, and that kind of thing. It wasn't based on tragedies.
Behind the scenes, we were digging up all the mud.
That's what it was, yeah.
And it was a different kind of thing. And you're right, Brian. They had a 6-week schedule, and they had to turn it in when 6 weeks was up. That was it.
But somebody's going to do. I mean, there's a lot of I've talked to a bunch of people that are kind of start putting things together. But somebody at some point is going to do a really good, well-done documentary on this whole thing.
Well, I think you guys should start on it right now. I think you guys should be the ones to do it. Seriously.
I wish I had the time.
John, what about you?
It's weird because Jimmy Koo, my buddy, he's been going over to Ireland 2 or 3 times a year to look at bands. And
he's a great guy, by the way. He hit me up.
He's wonderful. And I turned him on to Lizzy years ago. Well, he's big friends with Philomena, and he's lobbying for me to write Philomena's next book.
Yeah, Philomena's great, by the way. She's
which would be about
phenomenal person.
Which would be about the hotel that that she had that everybody should stay at and trash. But you know what? When that VH1 thing was over, I went back to get all my stuff, and Chrissy said, well, here's all the stuff that we got that people just sent to us. We don't have a place for it. We can't keep it. Do you want it? And I go, oh, absolutely. So I got some Powell videos I couldn't play, but I got a great fighting show from 75, if you guys ever want a copy.
No, I've got that. It's phenomenal.
The Club.
Oh, I love that.
Yep.
Incredible. But anyways, they gave me all this footage, and with it, some stuff, and I got all my stuff back and everything. But inside the package was Phil's death certificate. And I looked at it and had the actual, he died of blood poisoning, and had all the actual, medical terms for what killed him. But the name of the cause of his death was death by misadventure. That was the English term for it.
Yep.
I thought that was just a Ted Nugent song. I didn't realize that was actually
English term for
a term.
It's English, English, one of their categories of death by misadventure. But anyways, I don't feel sad about it now. I was really bummed when Hendrix died because he only put out 4 records and he was 27. Phil only lived to be 36, but God bless him. He gave us 14 records. His music will live forever. I don't feel like he cheated us anyway, like I feel about Hendrix.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in some ways, he could have tarnished his reputation by putting out a bunch of really bad records and propping up Thin Lizzy and doing up.
What do you guys think he would be doing if he was alive today? Who he'd be working with? What style of music?
He'd be a solo artist, and he'd probably be producing things for other people.
And I'm sure that there would be, look, they would have done a Thin Lizzy reunion a couple times because there just would have been so much money, especially over in Europe for that. That probably would have happened, and a couple of them probably would have been pretty good. They still would probably be playing festivals and that sort of stuff. But yeah, I'm sure he'd be a solo artist, and knowing him, he might have got into production, producing bands, and who knows.
Do you think there's any, or do you know of any unrecorded or unreleased stuff that had been recorded that might be coming out?
Well, I don't know about coming out, but I mean, there's a plethora. There's a plethora of bootlegs out there that have tons of demos, Thin Lizzy songs. I think there's about 5 or 6 different Thin Lizzy songs that didn't make it on the record that are on some of these things. There's a really great series called, pardon?
Man and His Music?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
like
great.
8-part bootleg series, and it really goes from the very beginning of Thin Lizzy all the way through all the solo stuff that Phil did, and it's got almost everything in there, like tons of live versions and tons of demos. There's a whole bootleg CD that are just demos and outtakes of the song Black Rose.
There's some songs on that collection that are good enough to be on a record. They really are.
Oh, absolutely.
There's versions of Still in Love with You that have like a halftime Santana section. There's some really good stuff. There's another song, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a very suicidal kind of feel bad for me kind of song. It sounds a lot like Renegade.
Yep.
But there's some great stuff on those CDs.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a Thin Lizzy fan, you have to really kind of search out. It's not that hard to find, any of these bootleg stuff. And there's also just phenomenal live stuff. Like John mentioned, that 75 stuff is just
There's
incredible.
also a show from 76 that has all the Jailbreak stuff on it that Dave Tedds gave to me from Detroit. That was a radio station show.
Yep, I've got that. There's a ton of really great live bootlegs out there. Like I said, I think I have 150 of them. So
that's the mix on that one is that's when Phil was playing Rickenbackers, and his bass just ripped through the guitars.
Yep.
It's just really good. There's a lot of stuff out there, but that's what you need a catalog guy to go through that stuff and put it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's good they're doing this upcoming live record. Like you said, 75, they were like in their prime. I mean, they were just kicking.
Well, you'll start to see more and more of this stuff happening. Now as the music business changes and things like iTunes and the digital stuff gets a lot bigger. It's like, look, I mean, it doesn't cost anything to put stuff up digitally. So
absolutely. Yeah.
I think you'll start seeing a lot of this stuff, provided that somebody's got the rights to it, seeing the light of day much more in the future than even now. So.
Well, cool. Do you guys want to throw out any information, or of course, if you want to get any information about Metal Blade bands, metalbladerecords.com.
Metalblade.com.
Metalblade.com.
Well, I've been doing what I'm finally getting around to it. I've been threatening Brian that I would write a book with all my stories in it, and I'm about 2/3 of the way through it.
Awesome.
And I got stories on Thin Lizzy, Maiden, Hendrix, UFO. In my book, it's going to be different, you guys, because I don't believe sex is anybody's business, and I never did drugs, so it's only about rock.
All right.
Thank God. A couple of Thin Lizzy's work. I know that they're updating their official site, but the Rosendub Trust, which is ROISINDUBH.info, is a really good site to check out.
The number one authority on Thin Lizzy worldwide is Adam Witt's family, the guy who runs that. He's like the number one Thin Lizzy guy. He was there. He lived it. He knows everybody. He has access to all their information. Everybody gives him their stuff. He's got copies of everything I've ever done. He's like Phil Oakes. Everybody gives him their stuff, and so he knows everything.
Yeah, there's like links to the trust on there too, so you can get involved with all that stuff. But that's a really, as far as Thin Lizzy said, that's probably the best one that just has pretty much everything in there, and it's official site.
One other thing that's going to happen is Jimmy's going to go to Jimmy Coon, my buddy, is going to go to Dublin in August, and you know what's really ironic, Brian? Metallica's playing Dublin on Phil Lynot's birthday.
Really?
And I hope to God they play a song or say something about Phil.
Oh, I'm sure. Oh, I can guarantee you they will. I'll make sure they do.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you could get word to Lars, I think he knows it, but you can't let it go by.
Yeah, I'll definitely. I got to talk to those guys in the next week or so anyway, so I'll make sure I mention that. I'm sure they already know, but I'll bug them anyway.
I've got their plan. Well, maybe you can find out what they're doing. But, another thing I was going to tell you, that Jimmy, my buddy, is going to be there, and Philomena has asked him to go through all the tapes that Phil left. So he's going to go through there and see if there's anything that's salvageable, whether they're demos, whether there's live shows, or whatever he's got. My main fear is the tapes are so old, they may not be in good enough shape to do anything with them.
You can still fix them. I mean, there are ways to fix stuff. I mean, we had to, when we were mastering the Black Rose album, we had the original tapes, and they were so old that they were starting to fall apart. I'm freaking out.
Don't you bake them?
You just have to bake them. Yeah. So we baked them, and they were fine after that.
Yep. I'm just praying that they're not beyond that, and that there's something there that's palatable that they can do.
Yeah, there's plenty of ways, especially technology now. You can find really old tapes and get them now and digitize them and everything, and then you can really fix them.
So that might turn something up. You never know.
Cool.
All right. Well, guys, this was awesome.
I think we broke the time record. Has anybody talked for an hour and 45 minutes?
Yeah, actually, we've done 2 hours. I've had to edit them down quite a bit sometimes because we always go off into different topics and stuff. But anything at all else?
I just want to say that it was an absolute joy to buy a Thin Lizzy record. And, I have I didn't say this, you guys. When I was running professionally, I was the only member of the Thin Lizzy track club.
Oh, really?
And I would go to these big, huge, important races, and I'd be standing there, and everybody would have Nike, Reebok, Puma, Saucony, Adidas, all these names of shoe companies on the chest, and I had Thin Lizzy on my jersey and had long hair and 2 earrings because of Phil. And I did that. I probably won 110Ks wearing a Thin Lizzy singlet. And that was a lot of fun. But, I just wish you could have seen all the stuff that I saw. I wish I could take that 76 show and just put it in everybody's head, because I can still remember what Phil's belt buckle looked like.
Well, I still watch those videos probably more than any other videos. I still got them all on videotape. You know, a lot of those old concerts from the Live and Dangerous tour, stuff from Midnight Special, and just
that's the good thing is there's so much stuff out there, and there's so many really hardcore Thin Lizzy fans. They've really gone out of their way to create. I'm pretty sure that almost any live performance they've ever recorded is definitely out there, and you can get it, because it's like I said, there's so many. I've got at least 150 of all these things, and if you're a Thin Lizzy fan, you haven't delved into all that stuff. And the same thing with the DVDs. There's a lot of really good DVD shows out there. There's a really good compilation that came out a couple of years ago. It's just like all their different TV shows that they did in the UK and stuff. It's pretty good. It's a bootleg, but there's good stuff out there for sure.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.